and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here this evening for our Jewish Week Forum on Is Religion Good for the World? Christopher Hitchens is the author of the best-selling book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. A prolific writer and polemicist, he argues that religion is a toxic force that makes the world a more dangerous place. Rabbi David Wolpe is the author of the new book, Why Faith Matters, named the #1 rabbi in America by Newsweek magazine. He's the senior rabbi at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles.
I called it How Religion and Why Religion Poisons Everything. I knew what would happen. People would say, what, everything? What, you mean chess? You mean tantric sex? You mean tourism? It poisons everything? Well, in a way, as I've gone on with this debate, and as I persist in it tonight, and as I will tomorrow, I would be more and more willing, ever more willing to defend myself in saying that it's a universal toxin from which nothing is exempt. First, I believe and I maintain that it attacks us in our very deepest integrity, in the core of our self-respect. Religion says that we would not know right from wrong. We would not know an evil, wicked act from a decent human act without divine permission or without divine authority, or without, even worse, either the fear of divine punishment or the hope of a divine reward. It strips us of the right to make our own determination, as all humans always have, about what is and what is not a right and good action.
And let me start with this idea that we didn't know murder, theft, perjury were bad until we found ourselves at the foot of Mount Sinai. In fact, I think that if you read the beginning of the Bible, which I strongly advise, you will find that Cain is condemned for killing Abel. Now, why is he condemned if the Bible assumes that you don't learn that murder is bad until you get to Sinai? After all, Cain is long before Sinai. Of course the Bible knows that human beings recognize that murder is bad. But the Bible also knows that they do it anyway. And that without a divine sanction against murder, people will think that it is a humanly invented sanction. And if they will violate it even when it's God's dictate, how much more will it prove to be, and I will come back to this, a fragile rule when it's the rule of human beings. And so at Sinai, what you get is not a series of moral rules that you never could have imagined for yourself. Oh, I thought it was fine to kill before I got here. But the knowledge that it is built into the moral structure of the universe. It's not a personal preference. It's not a societal rule. It is a mandate from God to all human beings. And if you think that mandate doesn't matter, all I can say is you haven't paid much attention to the 20th century.
Thomas Jefferson, whose biographer I am in a small way, once said, meditating on slavery in his notes on the state of Virginia, he said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. Once you've heard that statement, I'm sure many of you have heard or read it before, once you have, as you'll know, you won't forget it again. You'll always remember that he said that. But when you think about it again, or even at all, you realize it's a nonsensical statement. Almost an idiotic one. If there was a just God, what would there be to tremble about? If we were in the hands of a benign deity, a father who always looked out for us and wished for the best, where would be the rest of Jewish history? Where would be the rest of human history? There'd be nothing really to worry about. It would be like scraping your knee in the famous playground. How bad could it be? There's a just God. Now, I don't think anyone here who's studied human society and human history and the human tragedy, whether you define tragedy as the Greeks did, as the fatal flaw in our own design, or whether you define it as Hegel did, as the terrible moment when there's a conflict between two concepts of right, you can't just say, well, thank heavens at least Daddy is still on duty. And I'm afraid to say the only people who do say that are childish. What about that? What about the Quranic injunction to treat the Jews as if they were treacherous and murderous and deceitful. Wasn't that dictated by God also in the desert? What about His Holiness the Pope saying until 1965, ladies and gentlemen, that every Jewish person was collectively guilty of deicide? Wasn't that said by the vicar of Christ on earth, the man who held the keys of Peter, who had divine authority? By what right, Rabbi, do you say that you know God better than they do? That your God is better than theirs? That you have an access that I can't claim to have, to knowing not just that there is a God, but to knowing His mind? You put it modestly, but it is a fantastically arrogant claim that you make, an incredibly immodest claim.
It's not about getting goods from God. That's not what religion is. Part of the book talks about my own experience with my wife's having cancer, mine having a brain tumor, and my having gone through chemotherapy a couple of years ago for lymphoma. And as I was going through chemotherapy, I was very well aware that asking God to heal me wasn't going to mean that I was healed. That God doesn't work that way. That God wouldn't say, you know, Wolpe in bed 2 prayed, so him I'm going to heal. Bed 3, I haven't heard word 1. Bed 3 can go. And I didn't feel betrayed when I found out that I was in remission but not cured, and that I may never be. Because what I prayed for wasn't a doctor in the sky. What I prayed for was closeness. What I prayed for was the certainty that I was not alone. What I prayed for was blessing and love, not magic. Durkheim, the great sociologist, pointed out a long time ago that there are not churches of magic, there are churches of religion, because it's social, it's congregational, it's what we do together as well as what we do with God. Don't think for a minute that because some people misuse that force isn't real, and that God can't touch human life. And it is true that God can be pushed away, but after all, as the Kotzker Rebbe said a couple hundred years ago to his students, where does God dwell? And they said, that's easy, God dwells everywhere. And he said, no, God dwells wherever we let God in.
In doing your research and engaging in other discussions, other debates about God, and from tonight as well, what's the most compelling case that the other side has made?
You want me to give away the game? Are you going to ask him the same? Okay, yes. Fair enough.
Right.
It was when my mother had an aneurysm. And because she had an aneurysm and her brain was flooded with blood when she was 52 years old, she became aphasic. That is, she can't speak. She has difficulty reading. Her thoughts often get confused. And I thought, if in fact we are spirit, then how can it be that a change to our physiology changes our personality so powerfully and so dramatically? And I have answers that sometimes satisfy me, but for me, that is the most difficult challenge personally to religion.
Now, as to why I've ever questioned my own atheism, all of my colleagues agree, we've all discussed this a lot of times. The most intriguing argument against our position is what's called the fine-tuning argument. That if a few details of science and physics and biology and chemistry were a little different, only fractionally different, there would be nothing instead of something. It's true. I mean, it's a very intriguing thought. The fact that there is nothing, that there's something, not nothing, doesn't prove a designer, certainly doesn't prove a deity, it certainly doesn't prove a deity who cares about you or intervenes in your life or who supervises you waking and sleeping. But nonetheless, it's a thought that has to be confronted.
I talk about this in the book, and I must say Mr. Hitchens is only glancingly guilty of this tonight, but I think that it's a common rhetorical strategy of people who argue the atheist case. They'll refer their own beliefs to reason and yours to psychology, right? In other words, I believe what I do because it makes sense. You believe what you do because you're childish, or because you had a bad mother, or because you had a bad father, or because you need a crutch. But my beliefs are beliefs of reason. And I very much thought that. I thought religious people were weak, and they were credulous, and they were uninformed, and I wasn't. But as I got older and I learned about the lives of people whom I admired and started to admire other people and their lives and realized that the strongest among us are sometimes weak and the smartest are sometimes foolish, it allowed me the opportunity to re-explore what I had abandoned on the basis in part of a shock to the system when seeing that movie, and in part on the basis of an expectation that reason was a sufficient tool to lead and live a human life. And in fact, that all the kindred things that I believe religion supports at its best, of compassion and decency and goodness and so on, they could all be subordinated if we would just be reasonable with one another. This is an illusion that I think is probably fairly common to 17-year-olds, but no grown-up should believe it. And I suppose what I'm saying is I grew up.
It would never occur to me if I did believe in God, that, or in a supervising and creating deity, that I could possibly ask him for an explanation. I mean, you either believe that there's someone who's ineffable, unknowable, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, or you don't. You don't say, there's a God and I may as well complain to him. Why does he allow suffering? What a question. How would you know? You don't even know enough to ask the question. Otherwise, God is just a dialogue partner, man-made, as I would suggest, as I believe all gods to be. And I think your question gives away the fact that that is, in fact, the case. But the God who we're really supposed to think about doesn't owe us an explanation. It can't be asked for one. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? That's what worries me much more. And I see a great deal more of. So I just saw through the stupid claim that the apparent order and beauty of the universe, as my biology and scripture teacher tried to tell me, testified to an argument from design. I could see through that when I was 11. And
an 8-year-old can see through the argument for design. The argument for design is that this world is in fact designed so that it exists, even though it seems very improbable that you should get such a beautiful and wonderful world. So I wonder, out into the world, how one would reconcile such a contradiction.
Well, the answer is actually partly supplied in your own book, sir, where you describe, you use the phrase very suggestively more than once, of our creation, our little blue globe, alone as it is in the cosmos, as far as we know, being on a knife edge. This being a knife edge difference. Yes. That's exactly, by an odd coincidence, the expression I employ in my own book. Easily. So just out of one solar system, there's only one planet that isn't a complete screw-up, and it's on a knife edge. Some design. I repeat, this designer is either cruel and capricious, or incompetent and bungling, or both, because the two things are not exclusive. And in the meantime, the heat death and meltdown of the sun that will cause our oceans to boil before the planet turns into a crisp is already inscribed in all the laws of physics that we know, and the Andromeda galaxy is coming our way, as I told you, and the Hubble red light shift means that there will be so much nothingness that there'll be no way of remembering there was ever somethingness. What design is this? Yes, knife edge is the right word. And that's your deity. That's your omnipotent. That's your omniscient. That's your loving. That's your caring. That's your efficient. That's your designing authority. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, I really do ask you, are you going to repose your faith in something as crackpot as that?
Religion operates by metaphor. It does. The reason that it operates by metaphor is precisely what you said before, which is you knew early on that if there was a God, that God was ineffable, that God was not to be understood by human beings, and therefore if you were going to talk about that God, you had to speak about that God metaphorically, not literally. And so when you say sheep and then you make the metaphor literal, of course it sounds silly, as many metaphors do, but if you think of sheep as representing those who willingly follow the shepherd because the shepherd is going to protect them and make sure that they're all right and fend off those things about them that are dangerous and teach them how to stay together as a flock.
You think that's why shepherds look after sheep?
Then the point, again, you're literalizing the metaphor. The idea of the metaphor is to tell people that which the religion teaches as a value. It's not it's not a literature class. It's not so that you can dissect it and understand what sheep really do and why
why sheep is an inadequate idea for a human being to act. That, and I just want to put a last spin on this. A good theologian of any monotheistic tradition will say that the difference between God and a human being is infinitely greater than between a human being and, say, a 1-year-old. No 1-year-old could possibly understand Christopher Hitchens, right? You said that you have trouble even thinking of adults as intelligent primates, so certainly no 1-year-old could. If that's the case, then I have to take your assumptions about God's incompetence with just a grain of salt, because as someone who believes in God, I think God may know better.